We'll get started. If everyone can put themselves on mute, that would be great. So welcome everybody. We're at the it's the final event for Ambition for Ageing, so we're really pleased to have you all joining us. And we have two speakers today. So we've got Clare, Bonetree, who's one of the Ambition for Ageing team, who's been working on the Dispersed Communities research. And we also have Lawrie, who is our partner who works at LGBT Foundation, and who'll be presenting a case study on their work with older LGBT people. So just a bit of housekeeping first. As I've already said, yeah, if you can keep yourself on mute, apart from when we have the breakout rooms or if you want to ask a question. There will be a chance for discussions in the breakout rooms, and there'll be a facilitator in each room as well. So they'll have the questions to ask, don't worry about trying to note those down or anything. And the facilitator will give feedback unless there's anybody who's dying to do that. We'll have a chance for questions later as well, but if you think of anything while the presentations are happening, then please do put your questions in the chat box and we'll get through them. We are recording the event because we want to be able to put them all online afterwards. But if you're uncomfortable and you don't want your face on the recording, then please turn your video off throughout. It is really nice if you can put your video on, because as a presenter, it's nice to see friendly faces while you're presenting your work. And then when you are in the breakout rooms there, if you can put your camera on and take part, that's great. And then also, if you feel comfortable, if you're from an organisation, if you put that on your name tag and also your pronouns, just so that we can help to refer to each other in the right way, respectfully. And oh, technical difficulties. If anybody's got any technical difficulties, if you just message Lucy North in the chat, or you can send an email to ambition@gmcvo.org.uk. Right, okay, I'm really excited about this presentation, so I'll hand over to Clare.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, hello everyone, welcome. Really nice to see here a few people who were part of the research project and quite a few other friends as well. So I'll just share my screen and we get going. It's a bit of background. I've been working on inequalities, inequality and social exclusion within Ambition for Ageing since 2018. First, I was involved in the Equalities Board team at the LGBT Foundation, a partner in the project, and then in the programme team at GMCVO since 2020. So I'm really excited to be able to present this report today that we're launching. It's about people, not just place, and I'll unpack that a little bit as I go along. And that this presentation is part of the series of final programme events and publications. In fact, I think this might even be our final event. And that feels appropriate because AFA has put equalities work at the centre of the programme since the very beginning. Some of you may be, well, amongst you, there'll be some who are more familiar and some who are less familiar with the work of the AFA programme. So I really do recommend that you, after this, maybe take some time, go and have a look at some of the resources that we've published over the years, and really that will help to put some of this report in context. But I'll say a little bit at the end about the context and where I think this report sits in the work that we've done. Anyway, it's great to end the programme with this piece of work that looks at what it takes to ensure that marginalised older people are supported to be part of the movement for an age-friendly city region. So there we go, the sticky first slide. It's always sticky. Yes, and it always skips one. Right. Today I'm going to talk about the report. It's about people, not just place. I'm going to say a little bit about what we mean by the term dispersed communities and why we feel that term's useful. And I'm going to talk about the limitations of place-based models of community work and what we've learned from our research with community organisations that work with particular groups of people rather than focusing on a particular place. And we'll see how the work that these community organisations do is invaluable. And I'll talk about the kind of support that they need to continue to do this amazing work and to be part of the age-friendly future of Greater Manchester. Before I start, just want to say a couple of big thank yous. First of all, thank you to all of the individuals and communities who took part in this research. Thank you for your time and for sharing your heartfelt thoughts and ideas, and sometimes some really personal stories. I felt very privileged to hear those. And thank you for all the work that you do. I really hope that this research helps to increase the visibility of your community's needs and that it results in better opportunities for your organisations in the future. And I want to say thank you to everyone who's been part of Ambition for Ageing for the last 7 years in whatever way. Together, we have done some amazing work learning about and creating connection, deepening respect for each other in the process, and producing new knowledge that hopefully will contribute to a more age-friendly future that we can all benefit from. So first of all, I'm going to say a little bit about this term dispersed communities. What do we mean by that? We mean, and this is our definition, a group of people who share an identity or experience, for example, being LGBT, being deaf BSL users, seeking asylum, having the same faith. So a group of people who do not all live near each other in one area, so that they have to travel away from their neighbourhood to gather together, buy the food they prefer, practice their faith, or get the support they need. And it's summarised really nicely in the Supporting Ageing in Place report as people whose social lives, and we don't just mean partying, but their social connecting lives are outside of their local neighbourhood. Many, if not all of these communities are marginalised, and they experience inequality in terms of accessing support, healthcare, mainstream services, etc. And they're sometimes called hard to reach, which simply means, of course, and we all know this, that mainstream services don't always know how to involve them or reach them. So I just want to point out that not all communities of identity or experience have a strong sense of shared identity. For example, LGBT people might, but carers might not. However, older people in both kinds of dispersed communities will face similar as well as different barriers to getting their needs met due to the dispersed and spread out nature of that community. Although these communities might not call themselves or even think of themselves as dispersed in inverted commas, it's a term that can be useful to us doing community work, strategizing around this kind of work. It can help us to think about how to make sure that place-based models of work don't exclude these communities and people in them. So the bulk of Ambition for Ageing's work, as you probably know, was place-based. It was linked to specific wards, and it was delivered through microfinancing projects. But Ambition for Ageing always recognised the limitations of this, that asset-based approaches might exclude communities whose assets are maybe located outside a neighbourhood, perhaps in a city centre location that's easier to access. A focus on group work can exclude communities that are too small in number in that area to sustain a group of their own, or maybe they can't participate comfortably in mainstream activities. And the Ageing Equally programme, of course, found that members of small dispersed communities might identify more with their community of identity than with their immediate neighbourhood, and so not respond to and not be reached by tightly defined place-based work. And so because AFA recognised the need for kind of targeted work to complement place-based work early on, the programme included what it called scaled programmes, like, for example, the Gold programme, supporting older adults with learning disabilities to research the needs and concerns of people ageing with learning disability, community navigators programmes supporting the connectivity of older people in particular communities such as older people in small Bangladeshi communities, older people with hearing loss, and there were others as well. So having worked and looked at the needs of marginalised communities and older people in marginalised communities throughout the programme, we came in 2021 to develop and launch the Ageing Equally Dispersed Communities programme, which aimed to investigate further the non-place-based models of work that can support older people in dispersed communities in ways that they need. And there were two parts to this programme. One part was a series of projects and activities run by our partner organisation, the LGBT Foundation, and Laurie Roberts is going to talk about that in a bit. And the other part was a microfunding and research programme that involved 10 small community organisations supporting diverse dispersed communities. And it's the second part of the project that our report launched today is about. And hopefully Lucy's going to be able to put a link to that in the chat. You'll be able to access that easily later on. In the second part of the project, these 10 organisations received small investments of about £2,000 each to deliver short projects over the winter months, encouraging people to reconnect after the lockdowns of 2020 and 2021. And it was very much modelled on, in a way, the Supporting Ageing in Place project or programme, but supporting these organisations to work with groups of people who may be across a variety of areas, or across a larger area, not just in one ward or one neighbourhood. 8 of the organisations that we worked with in this programme were supporting ethnically diverse communities. One was a deaf BSL community organisation, and one supported carers. And of those that were working with ethnically diverse communities, some were working with very particular communities of particular heritage, and others with a mix of ethnically diverse communities. We then interviewed project leaders from these 10 organisations to find out more about the work that they do, the people they're working with, how they do that work, the communities that they support, and the needs and challenges that they have as organisations. And that's what we reported on in the report. So it won't surprise you to know that dispersal and distance is really key to all of these communities in terms of how they understand themselves, whether they use that term dispersed or not. They might not think of themselves as dispersed, but the factors involved in dispersal for each of these communities had powerful and different meanings for all of them. So, for example, for ethnically diverse communities with histories of migration, those histories can be defining. One project leader talked about what they called the scatter factor to describe the effect of a community being dispersed due to economic changes and regeneration projects. So this community first had an experience of movement and dispersal in becoming a diasporic community, living in one area and then being dispersed, not necessarily by choice, a second time. For deaf BSL users, it was quite different. So it was more to do with individual circumstance that was creating this dispersed sense of community. So, for example, travelling to dedicated boarding schools, there aren't very many of these boarding schools. People might travel a long way, and therefore a community, which is in part a community of friendship as much as anything else, and strong bonds will exist across distance. And then carers, very different, but again, distance, movement and so on is an aspect of that identity, but in quite a different way. Constraints on mobility and personal freedom are part of what defines that community. Whether people want to engage consciously with that or not, nonetheless, it's a vital factor in that. So bringing that community together can be quite tricky because people can't get away without support. We found that older people will travel sometimes really quite considerable distances to attend organisations and activities and so on, maybe across the borough, across the GM region, and sometimes across the north of England. This is despite the combined effects on mobility of ageing and experience. So all of this is starting to build up a kind of level of understanding of the value of these organisations to the people using them. And then project leaders, of course, it's not just about the value of those organisations, it's also starting to give us an idea of some of the specific challenges that these organisations face. So project leaders talk to us about meeting that challenge of overcoming distance and dispersal through providing transport, for example, volunteer drivers or buddies, and also paying for transport costs. And this is an additional cost for these sorts of organisations that won't exist for other community organisations. So like I say, all of this really speaks about the value of these organisations and their role of bringing people together, how seriously they take it and how much it is needed by members of the communities. And by bringing people together, we heard how they support both individual well-being and community identity, which in turn, of course, supports individual well-being in a kind of feedback loop. Sometimes organisations do this in really particularly appropriate or culturally specific ways, such as providing activities in community languages, and sometimes focuses on creating a space where people feel safe to relax and connect with each other, where they wouldn't feel able to access mainstream spaces. Sometimes when groups meet in mainstream social spaces, such as libraries, these organisations facilitate access to those spaces for people who wouldn't use them otherwise. And sometimes they have their own spaces. And again, there's a cost to that. It raises additional challenges for these organisations. But those spaces sometimes have really particular meanings for the community and are really valuable. Organisations, like I said, also work directly to overcome barriers faced by their community, for example, transport, but also to overcome barriers, other kinds of structural barriers. So barriers to do with inequality and discrimination, say providing direct translation services, help with reading letters from authorities, and also advocacy for people who are facing discrimination from mainstream service providers. And they have, of course, expert knowledge of their communities, because they are embedded in them. And this, I think, was a really key finding of the report, and something that we hoped to get across in the report through including a lot of quotes and a lot of direct speech in it, is really to give a sense, the sense that we had as interviewers, of how these organisations are kind of corporate members of their own communities. We talked about them being beyond community led, they're deeply embedded in their communities. We heard a lot of times how responsive the organisations are to the needs of their community members, how they're driven by what community members say they want, and how the difference between participant and volunteer in these organisations and in activities is often quite fluid. So it isn't necessarily a hierarchical thing or a step change or a progression. You move on from being a volunteer to a member to a volunteer. You don't bring in volunteers from outside. It's something that can shift about as people want. So it really talks about, again, this sort of reciprocity that's going on and how these organisations facilitate reciprocity within the community. And community members, so for example, often lead activities themselves. And all of this talks about how organisations, having been founded and run by community members, often see themselves as belonging to and really owned by the community. So this is a picture from Warm Hut, an organisation set up and run by asylum seekers and refugees, for asylum seekers and refugees. Just one example of that kind of organisation. And for me, it really typifies the way that organisations are more than community-led and see themselves as members of their own communities. There's a lovely quote there from Warm Hut. And so the workers and volunteers understand the people they support because they are and have been in the same situation themselves. Someone from another organisation said, "So it's all these things that I think makes our group different. We can relate immediately. We're coming from the exact same place. I've experienced the exact same things in terms of the other issues I mentioned, discrimination, inequality, etc." And someone else from a Black women's organisation said simply, "We are family." So as well as hearing about the work that they do, we also heard quite a lot about the difficulties that these small organisations have. In particular, project leaders had a lot to say about funding challenges. They had a lot of really creative ideas about what they need from funders and how funding could change to facilitate the work that they do. But they also talked quite directly about the challenges, and you'll see in the report, a lot of the language is really very direct. So somebody said, even when the funding is available, you send out your application, the chances of it being rejected are higher than it was before. I have the feelings always of not being able to provide services in a few months. It's like a lottery. You don't know if tomorrow you're going to turn up, open your doors or not because of funding. So they really, they can be in very precarious sort of situations, these small organisations. To be honest, it's really horrible, really hard. It's competitive and it gives you a bad feeling. It gives you a feeling of losing and winning and fighting, and it's not nice. And personally, it can give me the feeling of them having doubts about my professionalism. So beyond just surviving, community organisations told us that they need funding to support them to develop, to be stable, to continue to be innovative and adaptive and responsive to their communities. And then in terms of raising their needs of their communities, we found that although organisations have loads of creative ideas about how to raise the visibility of older community members' needs and concerns, they often lack the capacity to develop advocacy and policy functions, which isn't really surprising. I mean, that's, you know, we know that that's not easy for large organisations to support that kind of work. It often requires unrestricted funds. It requires particular kinds of skill sets and capacity over and above delivery of direct support and projects and so on. But this is a serious gap, not just for those organisations, but for policymakers, because these organisations have got vital expertise and their voices need to be heard, and policymakers just aren't hearing from them. So in conclusion, we found that community organisations supporting older people in dispersed communities play a really crucial role in ensuring that more marginalised older people are able to be part of GM's, Greater Manchester's, age-friendly development, and that place-based strategies have to account for small community organisations, because we think that that could enhance the support that they can offer to older people in dispersed communities. And it goes both ways. Properly supported, these organisations can raise the needs of older people in their communities to policymakers, who are then going to really understand where they need to put the funding, where they need to put attention, and so on. So we think that place-based approaches have to be complemented by targeted work. And this means supporting the community organisations embedded in and belonging to the dispersed communities themselves. With their expert knowledge and connections within marginalised communities, we think they've got a lot to bring to strategic partnerships. So with this in mind, our specific recommendations, in addition to our recommendations that place-based working has to be complemented by targeted working, we would like to recommend that mainstream voluntary sector organisations support small organisations, maybe through partnership working, by sharing advocacy opportunities and sharing capacity and transferring resources where they can. And funders need to address their processes to make them more accessible and meaningful to small community organisations, so that they're giving the kinds of grants that community organisations need, but also that they can access. And lastly, we think that local authorities need to ensure that policies that support the social infrastructure of communities include supporting the social infrastructure that's really particularly needed by dispersed communities, so that they can stay connected to each other and connect to the mainstream. So I'm going to hand over now to Lawrie and stop share, hand over to Lawrie and invite Lawrie to tell us more about working with a particular community that you're involved in.
Thank you, Claire, for that and for a great insight into the report and its findings. So my name's Laurie Roberts. I work for LGBT Foundation based in Manchester, and I run the Over 50s programme Pride and Ageing. And we were delighted to be funded by Ambition for Ageing as part of this Ageing Equally strand. And I'll give you an insight into the work that we produced off the back of this funding as part of this presentation. LGBT communities certainly fit into this definition of dispersed communities. In terms of our numbers, a conservative estimate, LGBT people are around, that's lesbian, gay and bisexual people, are between 6 to 7% of the population, and those who are trans, non-binary or intersex, they're around 1% of the population. We're hoping to get more data on that in the upcoming census release, but there are conservative estimates. And of course, although there are areas where we know more LGBT people are living, such as city centre, Hume, Levenshulme in Greater Manchester, we are generally geographically dispersed around the region. I've got a sticky first slide as well. So in terms of the over 50s as well, Pride and Ageing looks at a number of issues. In terms of the, just one thing to mention, such things as the differing life experience of a lot of LGBT communities, and Also the trauma and harm that was caused by within some people's life experience. For example, as you can see on the timeline there, before 1967 actually being illegal as an LGBT person, things like aversion therapy, conversion therapy, and as we go through time, obviously LGBT people achieve more rights, but sometimes attitudes and discrimination obviously still exists. And this is, nicely summed up by Ian McCullen at our launch, talking about being criminalised and that leaving a brand on you, and wanting to feel surrounded by friendship, love and respect. So that's something that Pride and Ageing tries to build into everything that we do. I wanted to bring you a few examples that speaks to what Claire's mentioned. So what happens when someone from a dispersed or marginalised community accesses a mainstream or general event? And actually we hear this quite a lot through Pride and Ageing from our LGBT communities who we engage with. So I've got just 3 quick examples to show you related to physical activity, which is generally activity that you might do with people from a mix of backgrounds that is focused around a local facility that you want to go to that's possibly nearby, may well be in your neighbourhood or close by. And so I captured some experiences just before the pandemic of our older LGBT communities accessing sport and physical activity. Kate, a lesbian woman who's 66, told us about accessing Crown Green bowling. And I just want to highlight the comment in blue here, talking about men being very aggressive towards her as a lesbian woman. I'm not available and they don't like that. They stand right behind me. Also the fact that in mixed teams, gay jokes are around but are curtailed when Kate was close by, and women left her out of the conversation. And when she reported it, she was told she was making a fuss about nothing. Then there was the experience of Bob, who talked about having a stroke and going on a 6-week wellbeing course for stroke survivors, talking about it being a really good course. But I just want to highlight again the part in blue here about some people were accompanied by their married partners. Bob was a gay man with a male partner, and he started to wonder what would the reaction be if his partner came along. And at the first meetings where everyone introduced themselves, he was reluctant to come out, and he felt like he was recloseting himself for the first time in decades. And finally, Peter, 55, a trans man who accessed walking football, talks about being partway through their transition. So they were actually transitioning to be a trans man, and talks about delaying getting back into sport and football until they felt like they could pass as a man. So they felt like team members wouldn't recognise that they were a trans person. But when they accessed football, they heard the men talking about women in a derogatory way, and was wondering that meant that they probably couldn't share that aspect of themselves with the group, and they felt worried about attending future football sessions. So it's this kind of evidence that really tells us like there's a justification for creating safe spaces for communities like LGBT communities in relation to the mainstream. It doesn't mean that the mainstream should not be accessed or can't be accessed by LGBT communities or other dispersed groups, or that these groups couldn't make a few changes and could eventually become more inclusive. But these types of experiences, or fears around these types of experiences, mean that if we create and commission specific events, these may capture people who aren't or can't access those mainstream groups, and they may want to just access us, or it may be part of their journey to them being able to access mainstream groups by coming to us, so we can be a gateway or a step on the way. So bearing in mind that with the funding from Ambition for Ageing, we commissioned some new groups which were monthly and based in some areas of Greater Manchester. There was also an online group with the consideration that as we were doing these from September 2021 to March 2022, obviously with COVID ongoing, we wanted to give an online space as a backup for anybody who wouldn't be able to or didn't feel comfortable to come face to face. We co-produced the event title, which ended up being called Rainbow Flourish, and the activities that we did with the Pride and Ageing Advisory Group, who are a group of LGBT over 50s from across Greater Manchester who co-produced the Pride and Ageing programme. And what they told us really was that just because you're LGBT doesn't mean you really like a specific activity. So it doesn't mean that you definitely like theatre or reading or sport or whatever. So they decided that rather than it being a group focused around an activity, we give it a title that reflects the rainbow, which is a symbol of being part of the LGBT community, and that it would be a group that's based around socializing and kind of would have a light activity based around being LGBT, but not have any specific activity tied to it. So we did lots of things as part of the sessions, including some craft. We did a session based around mapping out your local area and thinking about connections to being LGBT within that. We did quizzes. We did a session around LGBT History Month as well. So we had lots of different things with the kind of activity changing each time, but the focus always being around socializing, having a coffee, having a cake, and meeting people. And across the sessions that we delivered, there was considerable interest. So we had 90 bookings for tickets for the sessions, and we had an attendance rate of around 50%. So there may be some reflection on that by this group, but I think it's quite good at the moment considering COVID. It was a little bit lower than we hoped for. But for the people who did sign up, and we had a lot of sign-ups, most people were commenting that they hadn't seen the LGBT group for over 50s in their local area before. And that was their main interest and reason for coming along. Because there aren't LGBT venues in every locality, we worked with non-LGBT venues in the places that we delivered the groups, but we used a safe space policy that was inclusive for LGBT communities to create that safe space within these centres. And we used a very LGBT affirmative welcome, including checking in what people's pronouns are. We had pronoun badges. And we had everyone who was running the session was wearing things like rainbow lanyards, and we were very visibly LGBT inclusive. Some venues actually used this as a learning opportunity and asked us about creating safe spaces for LGBT communities in the future. For example, one venue we had a discussion around gender neutral toilets. In most instances, the focus was social at the groups, but in some instances, the groups started to give each other peer support, which we helped to facilitate, particularly talking about isolation during the pandemic, but some talked about LGBT specific experience. So for example, one person talked about coming out during the pandemic and not having any LGBT groups to go to because there was a lockdown going on. And they said this was the first time they'd come to a face-to-face LGBT event as an out LGBT person. So other group members were able to relate to that and talk about their own coming out experience and help that person kind of feel confident in the space, which was really, really great. And further to that, the space was really useful for signposting with people, asking other group members what they were going to at the moment that they might also want to go to that was LGBT inclusive. But we were also able to signpost to other groups, events and volunteering with the LGBT Foundation as well as signposting. And just finally, there's been quite a lot of ongoing questions or challenges that we've concluded from doing this work. So particularly the fact that we only had 50% of people booking coming along, which meant that we couldn't make as many social connections via these groups as we wished. The main reason for cancelling was actually COVID concerns, people talking about having to reprioritise their weeks to make sure that they could go to doctor's appointments or having a positive COVID test and having to isolate. But we do know that obviously some people may have booked but then not being comfortable enough to come, because it does mean that they are being out as LGBT in their area potentially. So we do know still that we might have to have a dual approach here. We may have to look at doing activity both in the LGBT venues and gay village area of Greater Manchester, but also out and about. So there's a range of opportunities for people to engage with us as a community organisation. Some people said just booking a ticket made them feel less isolated, and some people said they didn't actually come, but they liked the fact that it was there in their diary because they hadn't had anything in their diary during lockdown that was LGBT related. So they did tell us about the boost that they got from that. And some people said they'd only use it if they felt isolated that week, but they did like having it as a booking in their diary just in case. Attendees did have a broad and divergent range of interests. So we did talk to the groups about what would you like to do next time, but there was some disagreement. So, you know, despite being LGBT, they were far from a homogenous group in terms of their interests and strong feelings around what they like to see done. So we did keep it quite general all the way through, and the main focus was the tea and coffee and the socialising. The geographical spread still meant some people in Greater Manchester felt missed out. We couldn't be everywhere, so we had people contacting us from other areas saying, when are you coming to us, which would be great with further funding. And finally, we found the online engagement was not as successful as face-to-face. That concludes my part of the presentation on what we did. And there's my email address and webpage if you want to find out more about Pride and Ageing as well.
Thank you both, Claire and Laurie. So now we'll go into breakout rooms. Right, okay, so should we just I'll have a bit of feedback. Put your hand up if you're a facilitator. Who have we got? Sharon, Ellie and Claire. Right, we'll go to Sharon first, please.
I'm only going to share if you tell us what the joke is at the end, because that's kind of not that's tempting us and not letting us know.
Context based. It was context based.
Oh, that's what you always say. Yeah. Okay, so our feedback from our group, if that's all right, but please feel free to chip in. We mainly focused on the first question because we had sort of really good discussions around that. So it was about kind of the difficulties really around accessing funding as sort of smaller groups, the fact that there's sort of huge barriers that you might have kind of ideas, but you could often be deemed as not being trusted, or if you're unconstituted, you might be a risk. So I think there's sort of real difficulties around sort of reaching people and the difficulties that small groups have. And we were sort of saying that, you know, small groups may be run on a voluntary basis, or if not, they might have one worker who's doing a funding application, doing delivery, as well as making teas and coffees and sandwiches. So you're kind of doing a gazillion jobs. So that's a real kind of stress. Someone else talked about that services are hard to reach rather than us as a group hard to reach. Again, around funders, that, and I really like this, that funders' criteria doesn't meet the needs on the ground. So as a group, the analogy was used, the group might need crisps, using it metaphorically, whereas the funders say their criteria is you've got to buy biscuits. Well, the trouble is, what happens if you don't want to buy biscuits and you want to buy crisps, but you're forced to have the biscuits? So, you know, so it's about those funding criteria not always matching what people need. About the fact that kind of large organisations, however much you kind of sort of shift, can often gobble up all of the money, and that statutory services have often a vested interest to kind of keep the money because they want to sort of keep jobs. The idea of sort of creating more community chests where smaller groups can get access. So I think those are kind of the main things. About there's a skills drain we were talking about. It was very funding focused, that, you know, people have just get worn down with kind of having to do everything, and actually they want to just kind of deliver stuff. And then in terms of the second part, we want more of the same, but it's also about you know, how do you sort of get access to those people and know what those people want, and how do you do it? Have I misrepresented the group that I was in? Anything else you want to add?
Thank you. Ellie, next.
Yes, so we had a good discussion in our group as well. So one of the comments that was made of one of the organisations was about that idea of connecting more to smaller groups. We had some discussion around, well, following from the, you know, hearing about people's experiences of discrimination, particularly in Laurie's presentation as well, and about the expectations that of people being able to attend sort of like the mainstream services, and how those mainstream services may feel that they are, you know, they will welcome people, but they haven't got that experience of discrimination, and how those places really can be safe places for people such as in the LGBT community. And then we sort of got on to talking about people who might identify or have experience with different, as being part of different communities. You know, so example, a carer that also is part of a dispersed community as well, and sort of how that can make somebody more isolated, and, you know, some more work needs to be done around how many people are in those situations and what can be done to support those, and how sort of place-based strategies and targeted strategies could realistically be resourced across sort of larger areas.
Thank you. And Claire?
Yeah, thanks for picking me last. And I'll also say a little bit sort of wrapping up from today. I mean, quite a lot of things came up in our group, and one of the things that was really interesting to me, hadn't considered this at all, was someone was saying about how much was lost during the pandemic in terms of income. So as an organisation that had been trying to shift away from pure dependence on grant funding to build up income and so on before the pandemic, but of course all of that was lost, and they're really set back by that, and how slow it is to build that back up. People are nervous, people are coming in fully masked up, taking their temperature, all of that. It's going to take quite a while, and coming back in very small numbers, and really made me think about how there is this legacy of COVID, that it's going to take a while to adapt to the legacy of COVID, to integrate, you know, what the effects of that are in terms of well, economically, financially for organisations, but also perhaps in terms of our expectations of the kind of work that organisations can do and do. It's not just the pandemic is off, organisations switch back on, and it may take a while, and so we don't really know what that's going to mean for these organisations, for these communities, and for the partnerships that they could be working in. The two organisations who were represented in our group had crossover interest, but interestingly, one of them was coming from a community of identity, and another, you know, an ethnic diverse community of identity, and the other a community of experience. But of course, some people in the first community have got the experience that's covered by the organisation representing the other. So potential there maybe for the two to link up and share knowledge and skill sharing. And when we talk in the report about knowledge, about partnership working, we talk about transfer of resources from larger to smaller organisations, mainstream to marginalised organisations. But of course, we're also thinking about how that knowledge exchange is two-way, and that's really got to be valued. And I think that's really at the core of thinking about the value of community organisations that are experts in the needs of and then the support needed for older people in dispersed and often marginalised communities. So I think all of this speaks to what we were learning through our interviews and through this research. And
Claire, I need feedback as well on ours. Is that okay? If I just
are you facilitator as well? I hadn't realised there were 4 groups. I'm sorry.
So I'll just quickly do it. So because we were talking about, you know, there was a member in our breakout room who has a disability, who's blind, and actually found that, you know, the dispersed community that she engages with, she volunteers in a group, and that it being on the pandemic actually meant that the group grew. And although it's really important to meet up face to face, that kind of, you know, having services online and being able to access things that are in Manchester or different places in the country has meant that the whole world has opened up, which is something that I know we've commented on before. And then also talking about like the scatter factor, about how community has changed and how, you know, previously people may have lived in the same street or the same area, you know, close by, and then housing has changed, community has changed, and that, you know, people who perhaps weren't dispersed before have become more dispersed, and the impact that has on on communities, and then we also talked about similar challenges that Sharon was talking about with funding. Thank you.
So I think I just wanted to say, in wrapping up, that I think what's come through in this kind of piece of research that we've been doing, and the report that we've written up from it, is really, what somebody said, a culmination of what we'd learned throughout Ambition for Ageing, but really drawing it all together. This learning about inclusive and place-based working, that the two aren't separate, that they have to be done together, and that if you're going to do place-based, you're going to use place-based models of community development, they have to go with targeted work in order to make sure that overall your programme is inclusive. And that's something that I think AFA almost stands for, in the way that it worked, in the things it found out, in the communities that it worked successfully with. And in this diversity of learning, I mean, Thea's fed back that there's somebody in her group who had a completely different experience of the pandemic. Her community experienced the pandemic completely differently. We can only know that if in our programmes we have the time, the resources and the commitment to listen to the people on the margins as well as the people in the mainstream, the groups on the margins as well as the groups in the mainstream. And of course, one way to do that is to support partnerships between mainstream and marginalised organisations, so that platforms are shared, opportunities are shared, resources are transferred, knowledge is exchanged in both directions, and policymakers really get the chance to hear all of the voices come through, not just some of the voices. And I think in summary, that's really what I wanted to say, was thank you to everybody for giving us the chance to hear this loud and clear in this final piece of research. And I really hope that there are some people here who are able to take forward the learning from this in multiple different ways, in different parts of the north, because I can see there's people here from Leeds as well. So and share this learning far and wide. Yeah, thank you for that, and here's to an exciting, creative future of working together.
Thank you. Has anybody got any follow-up questions? I know there's nothing in the chat at the moment. Anybody got any questions? Just trying to have a look. Okay. Well, yeah, the report's out. It's in the chat. Thank you everybody for coming, and feels quite momentous, it being our last Ambition for Ageing event in Year 7. So thank you. And to all the organisations, there are quite a few organisations here who took part in the research as well. Thank you for that. And you can have 11 minutes of your time back.
In the sun.